Now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." When Abraham came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abraham well for her sake, and Abraham acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abraham's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abraham. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister,' so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abraham to his men, and they sent him on his way, with his wife and everything he had. So Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev, with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abraham had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abraham called on the name of the Lord. This is the word of the Lord.
I once went to someone at work to ask for advice about a difficult situation. And they said, "Well, what you're asking is a bit like asking me how to get from Westminster to Bristol, only you're starting in Brighton." And his point was, you should have come to ask for help sooner. You're in the wrong place. It wasn't actually the most helpful piece of advice that anybody's ever given me, because I was where I was. But it was true. I should have gone and asked for help sooner. And you could say the same thing to Abraham. You could say, "Why on earth are you here? What are you doing here? How did you get here? You should have asked for help earlier." And we're going to look at the passage today through three things, three problems that we're presented with in the passage, three solutions that are then offered, and three lessons that we're taught at each point. Three problems, three solutions, three lessons. And we come to the first problem here in verse 10, where we're told that now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. Not just a famine, a severe famine. We had a drought a few years ago, didn't we? One summer. Hard to believe after the month we've just had. But we had this drought, lasted for about a month. Very inconvenient. We couldn't use our hose pipes. And we were all very troubled by that. That was very hard for us. But this past year, we've been hearing, haven't we, about a severe drought in Zimbabwe. And we've seen pictures of where there's nothing green, it's all brown, it's all dry, the ground is cracked and solid, people are malnourished, animals dying through lack of food out in the wild. Severe famine brings a severe problem. So Abraham comes up with a solution. He has a plan. He says, we're going to go to Egypt. They've got the Nile. They've got really sophisticated irrigation. They will be flourishing. That's a great place to go and see out the famine. And it sounds very sensible, doesn't it? It's very logical. It's very reasonable. What's the problem with that? Well, we're going to see what the problem with that is in a moment. But before we see the problem, we need to see the lesson that we're being shown here. The lesson we're being shown here is that God moves in a mysterious way, like we've just sung. The lesson is we're being taught about what some people call the strange providence of God. What we mean by that is the strange, mysterious, often you can't really understand way that God orders the events of this world and the lives of every individual. Just think about it for a second. God has said to Abraham, go to the land I will show you. And when you get to that land, I am going to bless you. You're going to have loads of offspring, loads of children, a great family. I'm going to bless those who bless you. I'm going to curse those who curse you. And through you, I'm going to bless all the nations in the world. And so we read, didn't we, in verse 4, that Abraham went, and then he arrives, and he builds an altar, and he calls upon the name of the Lord, and it all looks great. And then the very next verse, what are we told? Now there's a famine in the land. Why? Come on, Lord, Abraham must have thought. I've trusted you. I've listened to you. I've followed you. I've obeyed you. I've given myself to you, everything. And now this? Surely, if I've done everything right, you're just going to fill my life with joy and blessing, aren't you? But there's a famine in the land. Seems strange, doesn't it? Seems so out of place. It seems unfair. Seems cruel. You've got me out here, Lord, for this? Remember the two questions we're being asked in this part of the Bible is, will Abraham trust God? And is God a God who can be trusted? And the answer to that second question at this point is looking a bit dicey, isn't it? You got me out here, all this promise and blessing, and it's a severe famine. Ever happened to you? Gone on that great conference, you come home buzzing, the singing was great, the Bible teaching was great. I am going to smash this week. I'm going to have the best week as a Christian I've ever had. And by 9 o'clock at work on Monday morning, the whole world has come crashing back in. And it's as if that weekend happened 50 years ago. You expected blessing, but what you got was famine. You go away as a couple. Get someone to look after the kids. You find somewhere nice to go. This is important. We're going to reconnect as a couple. That's going to help our marriage. That's going to help our kids. This is a good thing to do. And you get into the hotel and you unpack. Oh, should we go for a walk? Phone goes. Big issue with the school. You need to sort out what the kids have done. You expected blessing. You got famine. You give your life to Jesus. Get baptized. It's a great Sunday. You're on a real high. And all you get is grief from your unbelieving family members, and you get bullied at school. You expected blessing. What you got was famine. You've worked hard all your life. You've been honest. You've been generous. You've been kind, you've served faithfully at church. You are ready to enjoy your retirement. It looks great the next 10 years. And then comes the cancer diagnosis. You expected blessing. You got famine. It's the strange providence of God. Why does he do it like this? Well, the answer is you may never know. You might be asking the question, why does he do this? You may never know. How did the hymn put it? Deep in unfathomable minds. You cannot fathom it. Deep in unfathomable minds of never-failing skill, he treasures up his bright designs and works his sovereign will. Now, it may be that you do find out later. It may be you can look back on your life in a few years' time and go, oh, now I understand. I didn't understand at the time, but now looking back, I can see why God did that. I can see why he allowed that. I could see what he was doing there. But we may never know. You might spend the rest of your lives wondering, what was that all about? And I just want to encourage you, don't worry, you're in good company. David has this fantastic victory over Goliath and the Philistines. He's welcomed as a hero. He's the anointed one. He's going to reign as God's king. And within a few days, Saul tries to kill him with his spear. And what follows is years of Saul pursuing David in the wilderness, trying to kill him. You've got Paul, has this dramatic conversion, doesn't he, by the side of the road. And he gets led to the town. And he has his eyes opened to the glory of the gospel and the wonder of Jesus. And he is going around and he's preaching. And you're thinking, wow, this is it. This is going to take off. And he has to leave the city in the darkness in a basket because people are trying to kill him. And you've got Jesus, baptized, voice of God, this is my son, whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. And now go into the wilderness and be tested for 40 days and night by the devil. God works in a mysterious way. We do know why he doesn't work like this. We do know that this is not senseless. We do know that it is not meaningless. We do know that it is not without a purpose. We do know it's not to punish. The famine isn't here to punish Abraham. We know those things because Scripture tells us those things. But we do know that God tests us. He tests us. Not to see if you can do well enough in the answer. We were reminded of this in 1 Peter 1 a few weeks ago, weren't we? When Mark was preaching on the opening verses of 1 Peter 1. And you remember what we're told there in 1 Peter 1. We're told, in all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. Listen to this. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold which perishes, even though refined by fire, may result in the praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Like I say, this test isn't about you proving yourself to God. God knows everything. He knows your faith. In fact, He's the one that gave you your faith. That's what the Scriptures tell us. Faith is a gift from God. So He doesn't need you to prove it to Him. He's getting you to prove it to yourself. And He's testing it as in stress testing it. You test something to make it stronger. He tests you. He tests us to make us stronger. And He does it, did you see there in verse 7, for His own glory. You are suffering grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the genuineness of your faith may result in what? Praise, glory, and honor to Jesus. So we know that however strange this is, God always does it for our good and for His glory. All things for your glory and our good. And I know, as I look out here, some of you are struggling in the trial right now. You're suffering under a real testing time. And the dark clouds that surround your heart and mind, they show very little signs of lifting. You know the man who wrote that hymn we sang, God Moves? He was called William Cowper. You know his nickname? Mad Cowper. It's pretty unkind, actually, because the reason he was nicknamed Mad Cowper was because he suffered deep, deep bouts of chronic depression. He was even committed to an asylum at one point. And you know, he wrote this hymn as he was beginning to descend into another bout of deep depression. It's incredible faith, isn't it? How this man can write where he knows where he's about to go, but he can't do anything to stop it. And he writes, "Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his work in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he may make it plain." You may never understand, and the trial may last a long time yet. The question you've got to answer is, am I going to trust? Am I going to trust? When you can't see the path, when you can't see the way forward, when you're struggling to see the light at the end, when you cannot understand why God is doing this, are you going to trust him? It's the big question, isn't it? Will Abraham trust God? And sadly, here he doesn't. But what about you? Will you trust God to be faithful, even though you fear your faith may fail? Will you trust in his mysterious ways? Because ultimately, you trust him. Problem one is the severe famine that is in Egypt. Abraham has his solution. A severe famine in Canaan. Abraham has his solution. He's going to go to Egypt. Problem is, that leads to just another problem in verse 11. Problem number 2, it says, as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are." What is Abraham's problem? He's got a beautiful wife. Now, men, some of you here will know what a problem that can be. I'm going to not push that illustration any further for fear that you or I will end up in trouble. But we know what a problem having a beautiful wife can be. The thing is, it's not like Abraham can sneak into Egypt unnoticed, okay? I have 4 children. We cannot go anywhere unnoticed, okay? We have a big van, we have a big crowd, and we make a big noise. Now, Abraham doesn't have any children, but he is rich in livestock and possessions. Here's a whole caravan that's going on into Egypt. He's got livestock, sheep, cattle, camels, donkeys. So he's not going in unnoticed. It's not like he can hide away somewhere in Egypt and people will not know he's there. And the thing is, it's like Abraham hasn't considered this issue to this point. It's like he arrives at Egypt and he goes, "Oh no, you're beautiful. Oh, thanks very much for noticing." But that means Pharaoh, he might look at you and he might want you. And to get you, they might kill me. Now, yeah, it shows the evil of the culture, doesn't it? That women are seen as trophies to be passed on from one to another. 4,000 years. I'm not sure we've actually got much further. It's depressing, but true. But Abraham, he comes up with a solution. We'll just tell everyone you're my sister. Brilliant. I've worked it out. Then instead of being a husband that needs to be removed, I'll be a brother that needs to be wooed. And I mean, he can solve problems on the go, Abraham, can't he? He's adaptable. He's flexible. He shows initiative. He shows ingenuity. He is a clever man, and he is utterly unwise and totally unfaithful. You notice that God is not mentioned once. God is not mentioned until verse 17, when he graciously decides to intervene. Abraham doesn't come to God and call on him. He doesn't come to God and pray for him. He just goes, oh, here's a problem. Here's my solution. Oh no, another problem. Here's my solution. And the problem is that with each solution, he creates a worse and worse problem. You see the lesson you're being taught? Relying on just our own wisdom always makes things worse. I mean, it's not even that what Abraham did at the start was sinful per se. It might have been unwise to go to Egypt, but not necessarily sinful. It's not as if God said explicitly, you must not go to Egypt. So it's not a case of direct disobedience, but you can already begin to see that this is not a wise thing to do. But rather than getting to Egypt and going, oh no, here's the problem, let's turn back and let's go and ask God what we should do, he just plows on with another solution. And whilst it didn't start explicitly sinful, it very quickly got that way, didn't it? Pressuring your wife into a situation where she may be forced to commit adultery. Because let's be clear about what remaining in the palace involves. Pharaoh didn't just want her there to make the place look pretty. I'd put that in the category of sinful, wouldn't you? And it's worth just acknowledging, wives, I hope that no man in this church would ever put you in a situation that is in any way similar to this. But if your husband ever suggests a course of action that would lead you or your family into sin, you could and you should refuse. And I and the other elders would back you to the hilt. We believe in this church, in the good teaching that the Bible has, that authority and responsibility, leadership in the family is entrusted to the husband. But the husband is to use that responsibility to lead him and his wife and his family into increasing joy and godliness in the Lord Jesus. He is never to abuse that own authority for his own benefit or to save his own skin. So please let's not think that because Sarah submitted to Abraham here, that all wives should do likewise if their husband is abusing his position. That would be to misuse the word of God as much as it is to misuse the women involved. It's moralizing the Old Testament in a way that we should never do. And we're going to see that Abraham, he has a weakness in this area. We're going to see in a few chapters, he exposes Sarah and his concubine, and that's another issue we'll have to deal with when we get there, concubines. But he's going to put Sarah and his concubine, Hagar, in a situation where they both end up very broken and damaged. And then again, further on, he's going to try and repeat this same trick in Egypt with Sarah in Canaan. He's got a problem here. Weak and selfish men will always do great damage to their families. And husbands, let's examine ourselves this week in light of this before the Lord. Weak and selfish men will always do damage to their families. But let's go back to the main lesson. When we trust in just our own wisdom, things will always get worse. It reminds me of the time that I tried to put a mirror up on our chimney breast. And by the end of it, I had half the plaster off the breast on the wall. I'd managed to pull a radiator off the wall. And then I had to do the thing that I should have done in the first place, which was ring my dad and ask how I do this. It's the same thing as the man I asked for advice. How do I sort this out? Well, I wouldn't have started here. Abraham, he's trusting in his own smarts, but he's not trusting in God. He's not trusting in what God had promised him, and he's not trusting in what God had told him. What had God told him to do? Go to the land I will show you. What had God promised him? His protection. I will curse those who curse you. That's what Abraham should have trusted in. He should have gone, my wife is beautiful, That puts me in danger. Pharaoh might want to get at me, but God has promised me his protection. I will curse those who curse you. And so I'm going to trust in him and I'm going to call on him. See, faith is about knowing the promises of God. It's about knowing the commands of God, what he's promised you, what he's told you. And it's about applying them prayerfully to the different situations we will be in and the many decisions that we have to make. And the thing is, for most of us, it's not like we don't know what God has promised, and it's not like we don't know what God has told us. We just don't apply it to the situation we're in. We know his commands, we know his promises, we just don't apply them. There's a Bible teacher called Dale Ralph Davis. He says this: it's not lack of knowledge. We know the promises and assurances of God. We simply don't apply what we know to the situation we're in. Oh, we can be like Abraham. We're adaptable, we're flexible, we're clever. And we can be unfaithful. How many times have we made a mess of our lives and the lives of others because we didn't stop to seek God before we made the decision? That change of location, that change of job, that relationship that we started and developed, the contract that we signed up to. It didn't start sinful, but it was unwise. And in trying to fix it, we quickly became sinful because we didn't bring it first before the Lord and seek his will and wisdom. Or how many times have we failed because of fear? Abraham is fearful of Pharaoh. And we've been fearful, but we decided we'd work our way out of it. We were fearful rather than faithful. We were fearful of that reaction we get. We were fearful of that consequence that this would lead to. But what did Jesus say? What did he say in Matthew 10? He said, "Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We are to be faithful and not fearful. Whether it's famine or sword, will we trust God to be faithful to us as we continue to put our trust in him? But the story doesn't end there. When I fear my faith will fail, he will hold me fast. Because the trouble is, Abraham's plan worked. Do you see that in verse 14? When Abraham came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abraham well for her sake, and Abraham acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. His problem is his plan worked. And now Sarah is stuck in the palace. And all of a sudden, there are all these threats to God's plan. How is Abraham going to go back to the land if his wife is stuck in Egypt? How is Abraham going to have many offspring if his wife is in Pharaoh's harem? And actually, rather than Abraham being a blessing to the nations, can you see he ends up being a curse? Verse 17, the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abraham's wife, Sarai. What's going to happen? Well, solution. God steps in and powerfully rescues. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh. He rescues Sarai. She's returned to Abraham. But he also rescues Abraham. I mean, if Abraham was worried that Pharaoh was going to kill him on behalf of his wife, Abraham must have been absolutely terrified when he finds out that Pharaoh knows what he's done. And he gets summoned before Pharaoh. He must be thinking, this is it now. I am in trouble. No way out. And indeed, Pharaoh summons him, and Pharaoh seems a bit put out, wouldn't you say? He basically says, Abraham, why on earth did you stitch me up? You told me she was your sister, not your wife. Now look at the mess I'm in, as he's covered in all his pus and boils and rashes. But you see, instead of punishing Abraham, Pharaoh blesses him. He spares his life. He issues a protection order, don't touch the man. And he sends him off with even more livestock and riches than when he first arrived. Seems like Pharaoh's had the fear of God put into him, doesn't it? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting for a second that Pharaoh has suddenly become a worshipper of Yahweh. But Pharaoh knows not to mess with Abraham because he knows that messing with Abraham means messing with Abraham's God. And we just need to remember, don't we, who our God is? When things seem bleak, when the mess seems so bad that you can't possibly see a way out of this, when powerful people seem to get what they want, when you think you've messed up God's plan so much that there is no hope, remember who God is. None above him, none before him, all of time in his hands, all the power, all the glory, I will trust in his name. For who is God? The Ancient of Days. We have this little picture on our wall at home. It says, if you're worried you've messed up God's plan for your life, my dear friend, be reassured. You are not that powerful. God comes and he clears up the mess and he keeps his promises. Can you see the lesson? God is faithful even when we're unfaithful. Now look, that doesn't mean we can trade on God's grace. That doesn't mean you can go off and do whatever it is you want because you think, well, that's fine, God will forgive me. That's like being some sort of entitled brat, isn't it? My dad will get me out of this. But it does mean don't despair. Don't give up hope. If you're a husband here this morning and you're recognizing your failures, or if you're here this morning and you're reflecting on the decisions you've made and the mess that it created, and you realize how you've gone off and done your own thing without seeking God's will and wisdom, and you can see the mess that you're in, it means don't despair. It means there is hope. It means that you can turn to God and ask for his grace, and that he will be faithful to you even if you've been unfaithful to him. Don't trade on God's grace, but also don't be hardened to God's grace. Because maybe you're familiar with this account and you struggle. You struggle with Abraham. You think he has got off scot-free. No consequences. In fact, he seems to have done rather well out of the whole thing. What about poor Sarah? What about Pharaoh? What about the honor of God? And yet God is faithful to Abraham, even though Abraham has been so unfaithful to him. And do you know what I think? I think I'm glad God is a God like that. Aren't you glad that this is who God is? Aren't you glad that this is what God is like? I'd want to be careful about being too judgy on Abraham. Do you honestly think that you couldn't get yourself in the same mess? Think about how many times I've messed up my own life. How many bad decisions? How many times have I been a bad husband? How many times have I been a bad witness? How many times have I had these great moments of faithfulness followed by catastrophic moments of unfaithfulness? Don't I need the same grace that Abraham needs from the same faithful God of Abraham? Abraham seems to get away without any consequences, and he seems to receive a load of blessings that he does not deserve. And I think, hang on a minute. Doesn't that sound like me and Jesus? Don't I, because of Jesus, get away without facing the consequences for my sin and receive all the blessings I don't deserve? All because he was faithful, even when I'm unfaithful to him. God is faithful even when we're unfaithful. And aren't we glad that he is? Do you notice where Abraham ends up? Chapter 13, verse 1. Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Verse 3. From the Negev he went from place to place until he came to Bethel. What's Bethel? To the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he first built an altar to the Lord. And there Abraham called upon the name of the Lord. Can you see what he's done? He's gone where? He's gone back to the start. He's gone back to the start and he calls upon the name of the Lord. He's been restored. Where does it start for us? It starts at the cross. It's the cross where our unfaithfulness is dealt with through the faithfulness and sacrifice of Jesus. It's the cross where we call upon the name of the Lord for our forgiveness and where we receive all his blessing and grace. It's the cross where we are restored and where we call on the name of the Lord. I say to you this morning, if you've never done that, if you've never gone to the cross and called on the name of Jesus, that is absolutely what you need to do. You need to go to the cross and receive the grace of God. You need to let him restore what is broken within your life. You need to let him restore you to a right relationship with God. You need to call on the name of the Lord at the cross. And Christian, sorry, that's all of you, not just Christian. Christian, if you're here this morning and you are conscious of your unfaithfulness, or you realize you've made a mess, don't despair. Don't think you're beyond redeeming. Just go back to the start. Go back to the cross and once again call on the name of the Lord. He will be faithful to us even when we have been unfaithful to him. He'll not let my soul be lost. His promises will last. Bought by him at such a cost, he will hold me fast. Will Abraham be faithful to God? Not always. Will God be faithful to Abraham? Always. Will you be faithful to God? Not always. Will God be faithful to you? Always.